In this presentation, we will discuss climate finance in the context of development and taking a climate resilient development approach to adaptation planning. And so we want to use this approach of climate resilient development as sort of a guiding principle in all of our national adaptation planning activities, an anchoring principle that will guide national adaptation planning at every step. So we'll begin with an introduction to the concept of climate resilient development. We'll discuss examples of climate resilient development approaches in agriculture and fisheries sectors. And we'll also talk about how climate resilient development is important for strategic adaptation financing and how this concept contributes to the development of a strategic financing plan that could accompany your national adaptation plan. Climate resilient development is a development approach that integrates climate information into decision making. And it aims to limit the effects of climate impacts, climate variability, and climate change on the achievement of development goals. We know that climate impacts can have important impacts on the ability to meet development objectives at the sector level. And so this approach can help project some of these impacts and help plan ahead to account for these impacts on the ability to achieve sector development goals. Now, CEDAR has described two general approaches to adaptation planning, one that we call adaptation first and another that we call development first. Adaptation first approach often engages primarily in adaptation planning, while a development first approach engages primarily in mainstreaming or integration of adaptation into existing sector plans. Adaptation first approaches often focus specifically on climate change and adaptation objectives, while development first approaches focus specifically on development objectives that already exist in the sector. Adaptation first approaches often focus on creating new climate change laws, while development first approaches focus on proposing modifications to existing laws so that they better account for adaptation needs. And an adaptation first approach often engages mostly climate experts, while a development first approach engages experts across a wide range of government ministries. CEDAR wants to emphasize the importance of taking a development first approach to national adaptation planning and to integrating adaptation into existing development plans. And we're going to talk about how this approach can be valuable in the course of this presentation, and to talk about some specific examples of taking a development first approach that relies on a climate resilient development principles to identify adaptation objectives and to identify specific adaptation actions to meet those adaptation objectives. This slide shows a simplified model of a climate development approach to adaptation. Climate resilient development approach always begins with the development objective. It identifies climate risks that are relevant to the sector level or to the specific development objective that we're talking about. It describes in detail the impact of climate on the ability to meet the development objectives. And then it formulates an adaptation objective that takes into account those climate impacts and how those climate impacts affect the ability to achieve development goals in the sector. Now you'll see that this is simplified and that does not show the entire process of identifying very specific adaptation actions and implementing and monitoring those actions. But we also want to emphasize that just the objective setting process itself is a continuous, ongoing, and iterative process, and that it's important to constantly monitor and evaluate and adapt the way that we are planning for adaptation by constantly reevaluating our development objectives and our adaptation objectives. In the next few slides, we'll talk about some specific examples of applying this climate resilient development approach to formulating adaptation objectives at the sector level. This is an example of a climate resilient development approach in agriculture. A development objective in the agriculture sector could be to increase yields of staple crops. We know that climate risks that affect the ability to achieve that objective include increasing variability in precipitation and more extreme rainfall events. And this can lead to longer dry seasons and shorter growing seasons. It can also lead to intense rain that washes away seeds. Taking into account this impact on the ability to achieve our development objective of increasing yields of staple crops leads us to identify specific adaptation objectives that can help account for those impacts and account for the effect that they have on development in the sector. So one example of an adaptation objective to help us meet our original development objective could be to improve access to weather and seasonal climate information to support planting decisions. Another could be to increase the adoption of conservation practices that improve resilience to drought and heavy rain. Now you can see that each of these adaptation objectives is still general enough that it can point us to a separate set of specific adaptation actions that we might pursue and prioritize in the sector national adaptation plan. Later in the workshop, as we work in working groups, we will focus on that specific level of detail that we want to capture in an adaptation objective so that it's specific enough that we understand a category of adaptation actions that we can further develop into specific funding proposals. I want to give you one additional example of how failure to use a climate resilient development approach can lead us to maladaptation, or in other words, adaptation objectives or actions that aren't appropriate for the development context. One common pursuit in agricultural fields is to increase the adoption of climate resilient seeds, or seeds that are better suited for extended drought conditions, for example. So if we determine that increasing the use of climate resilient seeds is an important objective in our sector, we have to consider how well that action fits into the development context. So if farmers, for example, don't have access to markets to receive those seeds, then that, of course, is a problem. But also, even if farmers can access these seeds and they plant these climate resilient seed varieties, if they do not have the technical assistance to prevent intense rain from washing away their seeds, then that investment can easily go to waste. So it's important to consider, as we identify specific adaptation objectives and then later identify those very specific actions that we would take to meet those objectives, that we always tie that back to the development objective and the context that we're working in. Otherwise, we can identify adaptation actions that aren't appropriate for that development context and that ultimately can fall short of meeting our development objectives. This is another example of a climate resilient development approach in the agriculture sector. Another development objective that we might set in the agriculture sector is to protect the economic viability of rural livelihoods. But we know that, just as in the first example, the climate risks of increasing variability in precipitation and more extreme rainfall events have an important impact on the ability to meet that development objective because they lead to longer dry seasons and shorter growing seasons, and they can lead to intense rain that washes seeds away. A specific adaptation objective that brings us back to this development objective of protecting economic viability of rural livelihoods could be to develop weather-indexed insurance schemes to protect against agricultural losses. So in the first example, we talked about more of an ecological adaptation to help protect agroecosystems and to help increase productivity and sustain productivity in the face of climate impacts. In this example, we're still talking about the same climate risks, and the same impacts on the ability to meet our objectives. But we're talking more about an economic question here about protecting viability of livelihoods. And so that leads us to adaptation objectives that focus more on the economic viability of agricultural systems under climate change. Here's one more example of a climate-resilient development approach in the fisheries sector. So one development objective in the fisheries sector could be to improve fisheries infrastructure in coastal areas. But we know that sea level rise, this climate risk, can erode coastlines and damage coastal infrastructure. So an adaptation objective to help us address this climate impact on our development objectives is to identify both green and gray options to strengthen and protect coastal infrastructure from projected sea level rise and to reduce coastal erosion. When we refer to green infrastructure, we're talking about natural options, options like restoration that help rebuild the capacity of the natural ecosystem to buffer against climate impacts and to reduce those impacts on coastal infrastructure. Gray infrastructure options refer to the built environment, in other words, physical infrastructure that could help reduce the impacts of sea level rise on coastal systems and on coastal infrastructure. Now, the focus of our workshop here, of course, is to talk about strategic adaptation financing for national adaptation plans. And it's important to, again, go back to this guiding concept of climate resilient development as we develop these strategic adaptation financing plans, because this climate resilient development approach to adaptation planning can demonstrate to potential funders a systematic approach to accounting for climate impacts on development goals. In other words, systematically describing how a specific climate impact will affect the ability to achieve important development objectives in the sector, and understanding that adaptation objectives are depending on that development context at the sector level. It also demonstrates to funders a realistic view that adaptation cannot advance without considering the development context. Think again back to the example of using climate resilient seeds that are better suited for drought conditions. Even if farmers can access those seeds and they plant them, if they're not also taking measures to prevent those seeds from washing away during more extreme rainfall events, then we know that that's a poor investment in development in the sector. A climate resilient development approach also supports mainstreaming adaptation into existing sector development plans, policies, processes, and authorities. Adaptation does not require starting over. It's most efficient to leverage the current institutional capacities and the current development plans to maximize the efficiency of adaptation investments in the sector. This approach also demonstrates an efficient use of existing resources and development investments. And finally, it engages experts from all development fields, not just climate change. And this is an important point that we'll discuss throughout this workshop, is that adaptation managers need to understand the adaptation needs in the sector. They need to understand the priority adaptation actions and how to implement and manage them. And in order for that to exceed throughout the sector, it means that all experts from the sector need to be involved and invested in this process of ensuring that adaptation actions are implemented and sustained throughout the national adaptation planning process.